which is valuation of shares. Hopefully it is put to rest with the High Court decision and the revenue deciding not to appeal further. But on that also we'll share certain intricacies with you. We'll then cover loans, guarantees, and of course the landmark judgment on AMP spend, as we call it in the Sony case, the Delhi High Court decision, and round it off with management charges or intra-group services. So this is a slide I think you've often seen. Authorities have been very aggressive in the past. You've seen the number of cases which have been adjusted. In amounts, it goes into billions. The question is how much is sustained. And even in terms of the number of cases which have been adjusted, nearly 50 to 52% of cases on a year-on-year are being adjusted. So you can roughly gauge over the last 2-3 years. And when I say 2-3 years, I mean the audits for the fiscal years 8, 9, 9, 10 and 10, 11. So as you're aware, the transfer pricing audits up to fiscal year 10, 11 are completed. Close to about 2,500 to 3,000 cases are typically picked up for scrutiny, of which 50% plus of the cases are subject to an adjustment. Hopefully now, with the change in the manner in which they pick up the cases for audit, so as you may be aware that in the past there was a threshold, that is, if the value of the international transactions aggregated to more than 15 crores, then they would be compulsorily picked up. But now they're moving to a risk-based assessment. Now the parameters of determining what is the risk, that has not been spelled out. So one will have to wait and see. But what we can gather is what are the issues, what are the hot topics, or what are the transactions which are the area of focus will be the risk base. So when we say an ANP, so it could be even a 1 or a 2 crore now, you can be rest assured that the authorities will pick it up. Similarly for guarantees or loans, irrespective of the quantum, that's what we think that's the way it will go. In terms of quantums, what we are seeing now, 3 years back, we were, as consultants, we had this big issue on our hand that we knew the international jurisprudence. What we felt a big challenge was we didn't have sufficient domestic jurisprudence to be able to say things are black or white. But now, not that we're still able to say things are black or white because there are so many contradicting judgments, but at least we have a body of case laws, a huge body in fact, of case laws to fall back on to take guidance from. So there are about 1,200, but this is further updated. I can tell you, Deloitte as such will be coming up with a paper soon, but we've done certain analysis where even in the last 1 year, there have been 800 tribunal judgments. And what we see in these judgments is, and if you could just look to the right-hand side of the slide, 62% of the judgments, this is not something which is published by the revenue or anything. This is something, the source is an internal analysis which we at Deloitte have done. And we see that 62% of the cases are in favor of the taxpayer. So I was just speaking to a gentleman just before our discussion, and that's exactly the point we were, he was making, that the way the revenue ought to see it is what is the probability of the adjustment they are making of it being sustained at the higher levels. So forget Supreme Court, we're talking about it even at the tribunal level, that 62% is in favor of the taxpayer. Needless to add that the revenue is of course going on appeal to the High Court. And if you see again, 10 cases remanded back, 17% were partly in favor of taxpayer revenue, but only 11% of the cases in favor of the revenue. So things will definitely, there will be a paradigm shift in the way the revenue is looking at the transfer pricing cases. We've seen it also happen, evolve over the last few years. And the kind of issues they will also focus, similar to some of the developed countries, are on more niche, sophisticated kind of transactions, like the advertisement marketing spend, which, for the purpose of our discussion, we're going to call it the AMP spend. Or, things like intangibles, guarantees, some of the topics which we're going to discuss today. On the controversy process itself, on the left-hand side, we have that slide. I presume this was taken up yesterday. So, was this, Hineshwar, was this taken up, this process? It was.
Yes,
You would.
Yes, it was.
So I will not go through it. Suffice to say that if you see this entire process, even though they're winning at the ITAT, what we are seeing is more than 90% of the cases, even though, normally you hear that transfer pricing is very fact-based. So tribunal being the final fact-finding authority, it ought not go to the High Court. Cases even on comparability, for example. The initial belief was it would end at ITAT, but it depends on how you frame the question, make it a matter of law and go to the High Court, and that's what we are seeing in even all cases leading to, simple comparability issues. Of course, now High Court also we have a handful of cases, I wouldn't say too many, about 15-20 cases there are on certain issues. Supreme Court, few and far, whichever issues are also there, a lot of it is, direction to the transfer pricing officers whether to follow or not to follow some of the High Court judgments. So I think the final findings on a lot of issues are still awaited from the Apex Court, and that's what we are seeing, that the contradictory judgments or the positions continue. So what are the kind of issues? We talked about that 5 issues we'll cover, and I also spoke about the fact that you've now completed audits, at least at the base level, at the field officer level, up to fiscal year 10-11, nearly 10 years of audit. Initial years, what we saw was very, very simple issues on comparability. The back offices, what should be the markup? It was very simple for them to take, the comparables you give, disregard your comparables, take some other comparables, allege high markups. If you've used TNMM, they'll say, no, TNMM not the right method, it should be CARP. Or if you've used resale price method for traders, they'll say it should be TNMM. And on the basis that, whenever it's related party transactions, tax authorities say there cannot be a loss. And suppose you would do adjustments of working capital or capacity utilization. They would again disagree with that and make adjustments. So I think the kind of issues which they were looking at was also very different in the first 4-5 years, which more or less are, reaching a sort of a, I would say an understanding between the taxpayer and the revenue authorities as to the way it will go. Because remember, there has to be a finality in this case, because unlike a pure tax issue, transfer pricing adjustment affects the very manner in which a company does its business in India, right? So if you're saying a foreign entity having a back office in India, and they say we will look at a cost plus 10%, and authorities come and say it's a cost plus 30%, you cannot have uncertainty from a business perspective. That should it be a 10 or a 30 for the next 20 years, right? Because then there's rather say, let me stop business and move on to another country like Manila or China and have at least certainty. It could be a 5% more or a 7% more. I think to that extent, even the Indian authorities are realizing that. And which is why, I'm sure somebody would have covered this, you now have other dispute resolution mechanisms like APA, etc. And companies which have been having these kind of adjustments, more or less know, that certainty will be achieved in ABC manner. So, There are 5 others which we will be covering, but 1 or 2 which we are not covering for certain particular reasons. I'll just broadly touch upon that before we jump into the specific 5 cases we want to talk about today. You know, permanent establishment, big issue for a lot of foreign entities coming in India, having employees in India, a lot of installation projects, etc. There is the big debate about what should be the ideal attribution. Again, on that, while a lot of case laws again just talk about based on function, asset, risk analysis, what we actually see them doing is a global formulary apportionment method. So, again, we feel that the law has not really evolved in that case as well. And most cases are again remanded back to the transfer pricing officer to look at what should be the actual arm's length price. On imputation of interest on outstanding receivables, recently there's been this landmark judgment again of the Delhi Tribunal in case of Kusum Healthcare. Here again, just to give you a genesis of the issue, when I say imputation of interest on outstanding receivables, it's like this. Let me just take a plain vanilla case. Foreign entity, say, having a back office in India, back office charging a cost plus markup of say 20%, the money ought to come within say 60 days, but the money comes after 120 days, right? So the authorities are saying the money is coming 120 days, 60 days more than it ought to come, so therefore we are going to attribute a notional interest to it. Now prior to 2012, there were a number of decisions which said that this outstanding receivable is not an international transaction. So what did the government do? 2012, they amended the definition of international transaction to specifically include outstanding receivables to be an international transaction. Now, despite that, the tribunals are holding that when you're looking at a transaction, in this case, the example which I gave you, this outstanding receivables is included in the international transaction of providing services to the foreign entity. And therefore, you cannot treat it as an outstanding loan. And the very fact that it is also included in a working capital kind of an adjustment. So for example, if in this very case which I told you, if a company is giving a credit period of 60 days and a different company is giving a credit period of 120 days. The company giving a credit period of 120 days will obviously charge a higher markup vis-a-vis a company giving a lower credit period, maybe marginal, whatever, based on market conditions. That itself will, include or the fact that there is an outstanding receivable which is higher than the 60 days. So you needn't have a separate benchmarking for this outstanding receivable.
Regarding these receivables in the nature of international transaction, yesterday the matter was discussed, it was unresolved. Do we report the receivables in the transfer pricing accounting report? Because sales are already reported. If we report the outstanding also, then how do we report it? And will it not amount to a double counting of the same transaction? Or do we only report the transactions which are outstanding beyond the credit period? So that was the, and if we don't report, are we liable for penalty for not reporting?
So what we do is, of course, the transaction itself, we take the same example of what I'm telling you, that the transaction of providing services will be reported as providing services. Now the amount which is outstanding as receivables at the end of the year, that is also disclosed as a transaction in the final clause, the residuary clause, the last clause, as an international transaction. Now to our mind now, to disclose it further of only to the extent of what has exceeded the credit period, that itself is a point of debate, right? So what is it now in this case? Suppose, should it be 60 days, 90 days? Within the same industry, somebody will say it's 60 days, somebody will say it's 120 days. So to a large extent, what we advise our clients is, it is something which is an understanding between two parties. So make sure you really document it well in all your agreements. So in your contract itself, have an understanding when you're getting the money from. Is there a grace period? After the grace period, will there be an interest? You know, typically most people do that, mention it in their agreement, then have something else written in the invoice. So try and make sure that both of them are consistent. Then again, the interest, if you're charging, make sure you charge it if for whatever reason it is exceeded. So on reporting, the position we are taking is that we report the receivables, the total amount of receivables which is outstanding as 31st March.
Whether we report payable also?
Sorry?
We are purchasing from the AE, do we report payables also?
Yes, both. Suchi is saying.
Yeah, so basically earlier we were not reporting it, but when there was an amendment in this Finance Act 2012, which was a retrospective amendment amending the definition of international transaction, they included a specific clause writing receivables and deferred payments. So something like that, I don't have the act right now, so that is included there. So based on that, then we started including receivables and year-end receivables and year-end payables as in registering clause, but with a note, as you rightly said, that it is already included in the transactions, in the international transactions, which have already been reported in the other clauses and which have already been concluded to meet with ARM's standard.
So now there is no possibility of writing a note.
Yeah, but the practical position which we are taking is we then file the hard copy also with the department. So obviously I understand that that's a problem that we are facing as consultants of not really having the notes which is actually available in tax audit report. But then practically then we file the hard copy with the department so that the complete transactions along with the notes are perceived and are understood when the scrutiny takes place.
Then the technical issue would be that the hard copy signed by the consultant would be a variance with the email copy, the online filing, the report filed online and signed online would be different from the physical copy.
To the extent of
the notes, and then to just cover that, where we write the narration of the transaction, there we just write refer note below. Now because obviously there is no space for the notes, but at least to that extent we try to ensure that they are matching with each other.
I think the electronic filing also is just a new phenomenon. There have been issues over the last 2-3 years, so I think even the department is also evolving. The first round of audit hasn't come from when we file it electronically, so one doesn't know whether what the authorities will really consider. You know, whether they will disregard our manual filing and only look at electronic filing, whether they pick up the manual filing and say it's very different from the others. So until such time, let's do whatever we think is in the best interest of the.
What is required to be represented that if the tax audit report has provision for notes and observation and qualification, why not the tax audit? Why transfer pricing audit? Both are the same thing, using the same software.
I think the people who they engaged to draft it, for e-filing couldn't accommodate perhaps. So many, the knowing transfer pricing is such a complex area. We all consultants also give so many caveats and notes. So maybe one of the reasons is lighter vein. So in fact, just on that deferred thing.
You said you reported in other transactions in clause 19. But there is also a specific clause in clause 14 where they have these advances and payables. In that they have mentioned that as per the definition it's a deferred receivables and deferred payment. So in our firm as a practice we reported in clause 14, not the amount as such, but we reported that since sales have been reported, the same is covered and it is realized within a reasonable period of time. Would that suffice?
Which is fine. See, like I said, in this case there is no hard and fast rule that this is right or wrong. It will evolve, right? It's like guarantee transactions. till a few years back, nobody even reported it, right? And, or even the valuation of shares. Even in Vodafone case, nobody even reported it, or people just reported it with a line that out of abundant caution. And that itself became a moot point of discussion later.
I just got a doubt because in the clause 14, no, it specifically defines that clause, deferred receivables, deferred payables. And ironically, there is only a tab for interest rate and calculating the interest on that. Does that mean that they are asking us to calculate the interest?
See, we take a position of interest and loans. To my mind, 14 talks about loans. So, yeah. So what we disclose is loans and the interest.
Yeah.
And in clause 19, we are providing the outstanding receivables and payments. And just coming back to this issue, in fact, if I could throw some insights from certain practical experience. So we are now negotiating a number of APAs with the tax authorities. And even in these negotiations, some of them, of course, which haven't been concluded, the authorities have been clearly coming back and telling us, this is the AP authority, so remember that's a negotiation process, it's not a legalistic process, right? They are telling us that if your client will get the money in a shorter period, we are ready to reduce the arm's length margins. Right? Vis-a-vis somebody else, same kind of a transaction where, you know, it's again, we are telling them what is possible from our client's commercial practice. We say that, okay, they can get the money in within, say, X period. And they say, okay, then, you know, the arm's length margin will be higher. Also, there will be another case, for example, so taking the same example forward, wherein clients are saying that, okay, I don't mind paying the taxes, but I'm not going to get the money in. So it's just an adjustment to your income. So if I take the same example which I gave you of a cost plus 15%, just assume the authorities say cost plus 20. The fact that whether the 5, difference between the 20 and 5, I just simply pay the taxes, so I need to get the money in. Tax authority, AP authorities are very clear, you have to get the money in. So a lot of importance being given to that, but as long as it's embedded in your arm's length computation of price, it would suffice. Another issue which is again a big bone of contention between the taxpayers and the authorities is on location savings. I'm not going to cover it in much detail because I think another speaker, Karishma, will cover that in case of Watson Pharma. She herself has argued it, so maybe over the next few sessions she'll cover it. So I specifically requested that we leave that out. But very briefly on location savings itself, just broadly on the concept, you know, a lot of foreign entities are setting up their back office in India simply because they get a lot of savings. It could be on skilled labor, it could be on infrastructure, you know, various reasons. It could be on rent, etc. So whatever be it. So the question is whether the arm's length price includes this location savings, or whether a separate markup has to be given which will increase the so-called arm's length price to capture the location savings into it. Now, India takes a position that there has to be a separate or a higher remuneration, therefore, to capture this location savings. But the international jurisprudence and tribunal judgments in India say that to the extent, the very fact that when you compare the Indian taxpayer to other Indian comparable companies, even they have location savings. So the margins are comparable, so why for your taxpayer you have to have a separate location savings? So the concept of location savings, therefore, is not being accepted as such by the Indian jurisprudence as well. But anyway, so that's a separate thing which will be covered by a separate speaker. So we'll now jump on to the 5 specific issues. I'm going to request Suchi to walk you through each of these.
Thank you, Manisha. Good morning, everybody. So we'll start with the valuation of shares. As Manisha already briefed that valuation of shares, this is an issue which has been actually going on for almost last 3 to 4 years. The stakes were significantly high, the amounts at stake was significantly high. It has been now put to rest by a favorable judgment by Mumbai High Court in case of Vodafone Services. And after that, to clearly protect the image of India and to rather making it better in the eyes of global players, it has already been decided that the revenue and the government is not going for an appeal to the Supreme Court. So under the Income Tax Act, as we understand, the general understanding is that it is only the income which is required, the tax can actually be levied only on the income which is taxable in India. So the issue in this case was that whether issue of shares, the Indian subsidiaries issues the shares to the foreign companies. They issue the shares at a particular price. That price is generally, it is either at par or is determined with reference to some valuation certificate. Now based on that, if another valuation is carried out, either you change the projections or you change the factors which have been used to arrive at a particular valuation, the differential between the two is considered as the arm's length price of the issue price. So if it has been issued at 100, so say the Indian company actually issues it at 100, however it should have been issued at say 800. The differential between 800 and 100, which is 700, is considered as it has been considered by the revenue authorities as an income, and it has been added to the income of the taxpayer. And because it considering that it should have been received by the Indian subsidiary, so therefore it is something like a loan extended by Indian subsidiary to the foreign company. So consider it as a loan and add notionally an interest to that 700. So two adjustments. One is something which is actually receipt on account of capital has been considered as an income, and something which has never been received has been considered as a deemed loan, and a secondary adjustment was being made as an interest. So there were major cases, and you all would have, they were all there in newspapers, public domain, you all would have gone through those news articles. It was in case of Shell, SR Group, Vodafone India Services, HSBC, Bharti Airtel, Standard Chartered. So many of them were there, and approximately overall the amounts at stake were around 35,000 crores. In some cases, as Manisha also said, that in some of the cases actually these transactions were reported just out of an abundant caution, that although the assessee believes that it is actually not a transaction, but just out of abundant caution that the transaction has been reported. The transfer pricing officer picked up the transaction and said that you have not carried out the transaction, or you have not issued the shares at right price. So the issue was that whether issue of shares per se, the issue of shares, and we are not talking about transfer of shares, the issue of shares per se, can it be considered an international transaction? So just deep diving into the concept now. What do you mean by an international transaction? So that has been defined to mean a transaction between two or more associated enterprises, either or both of whom are non-residents, in the nature of purchase, sale or lease of tangible or intangible property, or lending or borrowing money, etc. etc. Then there was an explanation which was introduced with retrospective effect from 2002 by Finance Act 2012, which expanded the definition of international transaction to include international transaction includes capital financing, including purchase or sale of marketable security. And therefore, if we just read these two definitions, still actually speaking, issue of shares per se is not getting covered anywhere. But a view generally on conservative basis, the industry and the consultants generally have taken a view that if capital financing is mentioned, issue of shares is somewhere in the form of capital financing, and therefore out of abundant caution, even as of now it is disclosed. However, it can easily be taken out from the purchase or sale of security, because when you are issuing a shares, you are not really purchasing the the security, because the security or the share is not a property till the time it is allotted. So there are one or two judgments of Supreme Court also, not in the context of transfer pricing, where it is categorically mentioned that issue of shares per se is not a transaction. It is the shares become property when they are allotted.
Just on that point and coming back to your receivables also, on the reporting itself, as a consultant, we ourselves exercise abundant caution because the penalty stakes are too high, right? Because in 2012, the law was changed to say incorrecting or non-reporting is 2% of the value of the international transaction. So just because we believe it's arm's length, we believe it doesn't have transfer pricing implications, but we'd rather err on the side of caution when it comes to reporting. So even if you are not reporting, that's why a lot of time in the hard copy we put a note and we say, we find this.
So the question before the Mumbai High Court was that whether this transaction can be treated as a revenue transaction, all the money has been received on account of capital, and whether it can the deemed loan type of characterization which has been given to the money which has not been received or which in their dreams could have been received by Indian subsidiary, whether a notional interest can be added to that or not. There were other issues also which was to do with the valuation of shares, whether it should be discounted cash flow or CCI, what should be the valuation methodology that should be adopted by the DPO, etc. So specifically now I'll just take Vodafone. So this is a concept. Now specifically what happened in case of Mumbai High Court, in case of Vodafone India Services. Vodafone India is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Mauritius entity and issued a share which had a face value of ₹10 at a premium of 8,591 to its holding company. The transfer pricing officer said that this is not the correct valuation and the valuation should be ₹53,775. The differential between the two was considered as an income in the hands of Vodafone India Services, and he also charged a notional interest of 13.5% on the differential of those. The Mumbai High Court held that TP regulations are applicable only to international transactions that give rise to taxable income. Because this particular act of issue of shares is not giving rise to an income which is taxable in India. It is per se the character of this transaction is not income. Accordingly, it is not an international transaction. Neither the capital receipt on issue of shares nor the shortfall, if any, in share premium can be considered as a taxable income in the purview of Income Tax Act. Further, there is no provision in the complete Income Tax Act which actually brings the shortfall or in the arm's length or in the higher amount which has been computed by the transfer pricing officer and at which the issues have actually been shared to a non-resident in the ambit of Income Tax Act. In case of section 56 to 7B, there is a provision, but that is pertaining to residents. That is not pertaining to non-resident. And there was a specific distinction which was made by the High Court. In giving that distinction, they specifically brought that section in the judgment and said that it is not included for non-residents, and we cannot bring something which has specifically not been included in the Income Tax Act in the ambit of taxable income, and accordingly the issue of shares is not an international transaction and TP will not apply to capital transaction itself. There are a few observations also which I would just want to read from the High Court judgment. They specifically said that in tax jurisprudence, it is well settled that the 4 factors are essential ingredients to a taxing statute. One is the subject of tax. So the subject of tax, we need to know that it is included in the Income Tax Act. Who is the person liable to tax, the rate at which tax has to be paid, and the measure or the value how it has to be calculated. So like in case of BC Srinivasa Shetty, everything was there, but the mechanism was not there, and therefore it was actually excluded long time back from the ambit of Income Tax Act. In this case, the subject of tax itself, the very first ingredient itself was never covered by Income Tax Act, and therefore they concluded that it is not a transaction which can be covered in the ambit of Income Tax Act. They very categorically said that Chapter 10 of the Act is a machinery provision. You cannot make it a charging section. It is a machinery provision to arrive at the arm's length price of an international transaction. Even income arising from an international transaction must satisfy the test of the income under the Income Tax Act, but that has to find a place in one of the heads of charging provisions. So I just thought I'll just clearly let you know about that, on what basis the High Court decided in favor of the taxpayer. It has given relief to many players, and it has given relief to actually all the Indian companies, all the Indian inbound companies as well as outbound companies at large. And the stakes were obviously, the high stakes were the high amounts were at stake. After that, there was obviously there was a lot of tussle whether revenue should go in for appeal against this High Court judgment or not. And finally, there was an opinion which was given by Attorney General of the government not to file this special leave petition or an appeal before the Supreme Court, and therefore we consider that this particular issue is now under rest. And so I think the life is much better what it was at least 4 years back.
Suchi,
Yeah.
other than the cases of issue and allotment of shares, which are the other areas where this Bombay High Court decision, observation, fine application?
So
They say it should be taxable income. The income is, the transaction is defined as income as a transaction. But otherwise income is not taxable under the provisions of the Act. Then you can't make a CP adjustment. So which are the other areas where you can show support and they say no CP adjustment?
So, if I just have to take an analogy of this High Court judgment, where they said that anything which is not per se an income, which is not a revenue item, and therefore it cannot be considered, or it cannot be brought into the ambit of Income Tax Act. If I try to apply this judgment on, say, sale of shares which are, say, not taxable in India, some transaction which takes place, which is actually, say, a Mauritius company. One transaction takes place of a sale of shares of one Indian company, sale of shares of one Indian company by a parent company to another company. Though it might be a third party, and it might be a, say, related party transaction. So, say, Mauritius company A sells it to, say, Singapore company B of the shares of an Indian company which is actually there in India. Now, say, because of the favorable Mauritius-India treaty, it is considered that it is not actually taxable in India. But can I say that the transfer pricing provisions also do not apply to that foreign entity? Because Indian entities, obviously, for Indian entity, it is not going to be a transaction. Because Indian entities, shares are being sold. Indian entity per se either is not issuing shares, but Indian entity shares are being sold currently. So in the hands of Mauritius entity, can we say that this is a transaction? So if we analyze this particular judgment with respect to that, our view is that transfer pricing provisions will apply, because per se the cap gains which are arising out of that sale, as such the cap gains are there in one of the charging sections, and therefore TP provisions will apply. Now the next question is that if the income is exempt, then whether the transfer pricing should apply or not. So the court has not really commented on that. The High Court has not commented on that. If that income is exempt, then whether TP provisions will apply or not. There are certain contradictory advance rulings which are there in many cases. In case of Dana, Goodyear and Castleton, there are many plethora of advance rulings are there, which are quite of them are contradictory also. But till now that is not settled, that if it is exempt, then whether the provisions should apply or not. So I can see that one, which can arise out of that, arising out of this High Court judgment. Another is just like, say, Manisha took an example of location savings. Per se, location savings is not a transaction. So, the principles which High Court has really, though it is definitely not a capital account transaction, but overall the principles which the High Court has given, that transfer pricing provision is only a machinery provision. Don't try to extend the transfer pricing provision to bring new things in the ambit of Income Tax Act. That is something, those kind of principles can definitely be applied to many cases, many transactions.
What about income exempt under section 10A, 10B? Can we extend that principle? This income is only exempt under section 10A, 10B. So whatever, you can't make any TP adjustment.
In fact, this particular exact issue has actually been subjected to 1 or 2 rulings also, but it was categorically held that it will be subjected to transfer pricing in India. And in fact, there is one subsection in section 10 or 10 which actually says that if there is a transfer pricing adjustment which increases, because of which the price is considered as increased, then you will not get exemption, you will not get deduction or exemption under section 10A, 10B. So I think to that extent transfer pricing provisions will apply.
This has now been upheld by a number of tribunals. Of course, there was.
Now, my issue was, after the High Court decision, whether the old tribunal decision stand, because the observations of the High Court are quite vague.
The observations not only about taxable income to that extent. So, I would say it covers situations of issuance of shares, and I'll give you another example soon, and I wanted to, even if you had to raise the question, I wanted to mention that. As Suchi mentioned, broadly it will not cover issues where because of certain restructuring, sale of shares, etc., the income is not covered within the ambit of taxation. Those are the kind of areas which this ruling covers. But taking this issue of shares further, so Suchi mentioned now what we are seeing in a lot of our cases itself is that the revenue is not going on further appeal to the Supreme Court. So that's a huge relief to the taxpayers. Even the dispute resolution panel, we must give them all credit. After the ruling, they gave relief to the taxpayers. It wasn't that you go to the High Court and get the relief. So they followed the judgment of the High Court. But in a flip case, let me take an example. Indian entity investing in the shares of its subsidiary overseas. So the value is, let's assume, 10. It invests at 50. To the extent of the difference between 50 and 10, 40, the tax authorities were saying that you've given a loan and we're going to charge you interest on it. Perpetuity. You wouldn't really make, get back the 40, which means that every year on year, they were, a notional interest. Now we thought with this ruling, even that issue had died, because it is also the flip side. You are investing in the shares of your subsidiary. But unfortunately, what we are seeing is that they've applied this the ratio of this judgment squarely to cases, foreign entity investing in shares of the Indian entity, not even the restructuring cases which she mentioned, as she rightly mentioned. There also, therefore, we are taking a conservative stand, at least up to now, and we are saying yes, we will disclose it, we will get a valuation certificate to justify. Indian entity investing overseas, we are still disclosing, but we are very surprised to see that they are going on appeal to the higher limits. And
Okay, we continue.
on the loan itself, just to give you also an understanding of this notional interest and how the international jurisprudence works, which will be useful because we're talking about newer issues coming up. See, one big concern of tax authorities worldwide is what is called the secondary adjustment. So let me take that very example. So I will use that very example which I gave you of a back office service provider having a 15%. Tax authority saying it's a 20%. A lot of companies were quite happy sometimes to say, okay, it's 20%. Let me just pay the taxes to the extent of 5. But there are certain jurisdictions like Canada which say that no, to the extent of the difference between 20 and 15, the 5%, we will treat it as loan. You've not got the money into the country. So unless you get that money into the country, or it could be the flip side, if India has to make the payment, they treat it as dividend. So this is an incoming, so they treat it as a loan. And they say, till you get the money in, we will charge you an interest. So this is what is commonly called as a secondary adjustment. And so in this valuation of shares, Suchi mentioned there were 2 adjustments they made, if you recollect. One was the difference between the price at which the share was issued and the price at which the authorities thought the shares ought to be issued. The difference between the 8,000 and the 80,000 and the 5,000. The second one was they said, okay, now on the difference, you've not brought the money in, we're going to charge you interest. Just remember that interest would have continued year on to perpetuity till the money wouldn't have been brought. So that, one way to look at it is termed as a secondary adjustment. So an argument which was also being raised by taxpayers was that the law in India nowhere provides for a secondary adjustment. Whereas there are other countries, as I gave you an example of Canada, which in their legislation somewhere clearly mention about a secondary adjustment. So, of course, this affects the Indian government as well, no? Because if you agree that it's a 15%, if you say it's a 15 and the government says it's a 20, it's very easy actually to just pay the 5% difference, 33 or a 5. But if you actually brought the 20, the money is coming to the country, you would then, have a dividend distribution tax to repay it back to the foreign entity. To that extent, there is a loss to the Indian exchequer. So to my mind, my personal view is, we'll probably see that happening in a few years from now, because even the Indian tax authorities are looking at ways to see how their revenue, rightly can be also increased.
If at all the secondary adjustment of interest has to be made and sustained, whether the rate of interest prevailing in India will apply or the rate of interest prevailing in
That is, the rate of interest should depend on the currency in which you make the repayment. That is the statutory law. But Suchi has a specific issue on interest itself, which you.
Because you mentioned the locational saving. Since locational saving does not have a legislative location,
See, that's exactly, if you see the transfer pricing law, a lot of it doesn't have statutory recognition. There is only one section, 92, and only one rule. So, a lot of economic adjustments don't have statutory recognition. But it doesn't mean that it cannot be. It's just a concept or an argument to enhance or keep the arm's length price to what it is.
Thanks. Okay, we'll go to another issue which is there in terms of loan, that at how the loans have to be benchmarked. Okay, before I come to the judgment, it is in the case of Cotton Naturals, very recent judgment of Delhi High Court, that how in case of loans which have been given by, say, from Indian MNC, the outbound company to a company, say, in USA, like in this case it was an Indian MNC and it gave loan to a distribution marketing entity which was in the USA, at what rate the loan should be, and the loan was actually there it was denominated in foreign currency, so it was at some LIBOR plus a particular, say, 200 basis points. Now the question in this case was that whether the foreign currency denominated loan, which is which is LIBOR plus something, it needs to be compared with that kind of nomenclature, which is again LIBOR plus. So it has to be compared with foreign currency loan, or we need to see that what is the cost of funds of Indian entity, or use some prime lending rate of the rates prevailing in India. So use the prime lending rate of SBI or some other bank. So whether the borrower should be considered kind of a tested party, and we need to see that whether at what rate borrower should have actually got it in that market, or what is the borrower's capacity to pay that much interest, or should we see it from Indian entity perspective, that had it kept that much fund, what it has actually kept it with what it has actually granted to the foreign subsidiary, what is the opportunity loss in the hands of Indian entity. So had it kept in FD, that much money, had it kept in FD, or had it given to another Indian entity, that much loan, had it given to another Indian entity, what is the income that Indian entity should have earned. So that is actually the issue, that whether I need to consider what borrower should have paid, and whether I need to consider foreign currency benchmarks, I have to consider loans which are actually foreign currency denominated, or do I need to consider Indian entity, had it kept its funds in some FD or in some other, had it given it to some other borrower, at what rate this entity would have earned income. So this has been the primary contention. There are a few other issues which have really got resolved in terms of in other judgments, like say interest-free loan cannot be given. The terms and the conditions of the loan are very important. We need to see whether it is fixed rate or floating rate, etc., etc. And whether CUP is the most appropriate method, or any other method can be considered as the most appropriate method. So broadly, the principles which are already adjudicated are that yes, CUP is the most appropriate method. Anything which has to be compared, we need to see the terms and conditions of each loan agreement. The interest-free loans are generally not accepted. We have to see the credit risk of the borrower, lender, etc., etc. Now this is the issue which has actually been, the issue which I just explained, that has actually been there for almost, I will say, last 6-7 years in many cases. It was there also in the cases of loan, it was also in the cases of this interest, notional interest on receivables. So what should be the loan interest rate that should be used to ultimately determine the arm's length price, specifically in case of foreign currency denominated loans. Now in this case, there was the tribunal the TPO had actually very beautifully made a chart in the order, which was actually prepared, and I have not captured the chart here, which was actually prepared for lender and for borrower. And in both the cases, he has tried to peruse that transaction from Indian entity perspective, that if Indian entity is a borrower, then I will see India rates, that how much Indian entity can minimize, and when Indian entity is a lender, then Indian entity will see how much it can maximize. So the High Court said that you cannot apply the same law, that you cannot apply really the benefits only from Indian entity perspective. You cannot look at this transaction from Indian entity perspective only. You have to see the transaction overall. You have to see, ultimately what you have to see is that no tax base erosion, but you also have to see that what is the objective behind lending this money, whether this money has been lent to augment the business of the US company, what has been the understanding of the parties, and we cannot ignore at all the currency in which the loan has been denominated. So the court referred to a commentary given by Klaus Vogel, and he categorically said that the differential between the rates which are in Indian currency and in foreign currency, those are actually on account of foreign currency. Those are not on account of place in which that particular transaction has arisen. So it is not because a transaction has been undertaken in US or between US and Indian entity, therefore the final exchange, the final effective rate of interest is less. However, it is because and had it been undertaken between two Indian entities, therefore the interest rate would have been more. But it is on account of the currency in which the loan or currency in which the transaction has been undertaken. So I'll just give you an example again, just trying to explain it with an example. We have seen that, okay, if an Indian entity borrows a loan from say SBI, it will be say around 12%, just assume it will be 12%, and if the same entity actually borrows an external commercial borrowing, which is actually foreign currency denominated, it is generally say LIBOR plus, I'll take the highest ceiling, say LIBOR plus 500 basis points. Now LIBOR plus 500 basis points effectively will come to somewhere near 9%. Now same Indian entity when borrowing from SBI is borrowing at 12%, and when same Indian entity is borrowing ECB, it is borrowing, the effective rate in the hands of the Indian entity is 9%. In fact, a lot of Indian companies, because of this reason, have actually converted their Indian currency loans in foreign currency loans because they wanted to take advantage of the lower rate of interest. So why this lower rate of interest? So this particular example itself proves that the rate of interest, the differential in the rate of interest is because of the change in currency. So if the transaction has been undertaken in a particular currency, then the transfer pricing officer cannot just change the currency and recharacterize the transaction and consider it only from Indian entity perspective who has been the lender. So therefore in this case, the High Court very categorically stated that Chapter 10 in transfer pricing, they do not permit the revenue authorities to step into the shoes of the assessee and decide, one is that whether the transaction should have been undertaken or should not have been. If the TPO is comparing the loan advanced to Indian unrelated party, what TPO tried to do is that had this loan been given to an Indian unrelated party, then what should have been the interest rate? So that is completely, which is unacceptable and not logical. What the assessee would have earned, which I just explained, and therefore you cannot really apply different parameters when it comes to inbound, when it comes to outbound. So which I just explained you, that he very beautifully explained the chart and tries to everywhere try to see it from Indian perspective of minimization and maximization of value. The currency in which the loan is to be repaid normally determines the rate of return, which I just explained by way of an example. And it actually accepted parameters recommended by Clause Virgil in Article 11 of Double Taxation Conventions to dismiss the applicability of PLR for determining interest rate to be paid in foreign currency. And the existing differences in the levels of interest is only on account of currency and do not depend on account of place. So, this is something which we have seen in most of the transfer pricing officer try to consider Indian PLR and they just apply, make the adjustment. What we need to always take care is that, now this case I will say, it's a very recent case. It has just come, I think, just 15 days back. It is a very recent case and it has covered all the judgments which have been pronounced till date. It has also distinguished Logic Micro, which was, I think, a Bangalore tribunal judgment, which has actually upheld that Indian PLR rate can be used for foreign currency. So it has even distinguished that also. So therefore, this is something which can now be used to defend all the cases, and I will say to an extent this controversy has been put to rest. Nashi, want to add here?
I think this is fine. Suchi, we probably need to just 11:30, we have 25 minutes.
Okay. So I quickly take guarantee. I quickly take
My
expect
suggestion
AMP.
is, yeah, I think one issue we'd like to spend time is on the AMP. So maybe we jump to AMP
Okay.
and then we close with the guarantees and
Sure.
other issues. So maybe 15 minutes on AMP and then 5 minutes on guarantee and 5 minutes on
Sure.
intra-concerns.
Now, AMP, this is also a very hot issue which has been there for almost, I will say, last 5 years in India. Transfer pricing officers started making adjustment. I'll firstly explain the concept. So, the concept is that, say, Indian entity, either the distributors, who are actually just buying the goods and selling the goods under a particular brand, or the products, say, Lux, Pierce, or say Honda, Maruti, or Suzuki. So so under these brand, or BMW, or LG, Samsung. So all these brand names are owned by the foreign entities. So either as manufacturer or as distributors. Now Indian entity, either as distributor or as manufacturer, they actually sell the product under those brand names, because if the manufacturers are using the technology and the brand name, they pay the royalty, and the distributors, they are only selling the products using that brand name. Generally the brand royalty is not paid, it is generally embedded in the price. Now obviously both the type of categories of Indian companies, whether distributors or manufacturers, both incur heavy advertisement marketing expenditure to ensure that the sales happen. And what department does, what department did is, department applied a test called Bright Line test. The Bright Line test is, it is a test which is used to test the AMP expenses to try to categorize the non-routine and routine expenditure. So what you will do is that they computed a ratio, AMP upon turnover of the tested party as well of the Indian entity, which was considered as tested party in most of the cases, and considered that and compared the same ratio of the comparables. Say in case of comparables, if it came as 5%, and in case of tested party if it comes 10%. So the conclusion was that extra 5% is something which should be reimbursed by the foreign company, because the Indian entity has helped the foreign company in doing the brand building of foreign entity in India, and because it is a type of service, so again a secondary adjustment, and because it can be considered a type of service, therefore a 10% or 15% markup should also be earned by the Indian entity. So although Indian entity might be acting, might be pure distributor, might be a manufacturer, might be, because of that advertisement marketing expenditure, it might have been actually getting very good revenues, and which is only taxable in India. The profit arising of those revenues are only taxable in India. But this was the test which was done by the revenue authorities, and they said that anything extra has to be borne by the foreign entity, and because it is a kind of service which has been done by Indian entity, there has to be an arm's length markup also to be charged on that.
So the crux of it is, in the case of a distributor or a licensed manufacturer, the question is the Indian entity enhancing the brand of the foreign entity? Is it providing the service of enhancing the brand? And if so, should it be remunerated, and how much should it be remunerated? That's the whole issue.
Yeah. And it's an issue, I just want to highlight, it's not an issue only in India, it's a global issue. There have been issues in case of DHL, in case of GlaxoSmithKline, etc. in US also. So it is not, but I think in India the law has evolved. The law has evolved with this judgment, I will say, considerably. So I have put some of the verbatims also, because it's a very long judgment. So I've tried to capture it point wise. So the summary of the judgment is that in case of, so there, okay, just before that, before this there was a special bench. I don't want to miss that link. There was a special bench in case of LG, which was actually a manufacturer, was set up in Delhi, and there was a decision by special bench that all this extra expenditure of AMP is an international transaction, and the Indian entity also needs to earn a markup on that. So it needs to get the reimbursement of that AMP expenditure, and it needs to earn a markup on that. So that had gone purely in the favor of revenue. They gave some guidance principles that how you need to compute, and they also gave partial relief in terms of the trade discounts or some other one or two items may not be included while computing AMP upon turnover. But broadly, I will say that it had gone in favor of the revenue. This particular, and following that judgment, in case of, though that judgment was purely in case of a manufacturer, but the principles which was laid down by LG special bench was applied blindfolded in all other following cases, in whether it was a case of a manufacturer or it was a case of a distributor. It was applied and there was most of them, in fact I will say other than BMW, which was a distributor, all other cases were adjusted against, and the tribunal gave the judgment in favor of revenue against the SSE. So in case of Sony Ericsson, Canon India, Reebok India, and there are a few others, it was appealed in the High Court, and this judgment in the High Court is not really against LG case, but it is actually against the cases which have applied LG. So just wanted to differentiate that this is, though it has overruled certain principles of LG special bench, but LG was actually in case of a manufacturer, and this is a judgment not against that judgment, but it is a judgment against the appeals which had followed against the judgments which had followed LG. So High Court also actually upheld that AMP expenditure can be considered an international transaction, but they said that increased AMP expenditure does not presuppose the contribution to brand building for its overseas and associated enterprise. The brand value is something which is not created by only extra expenditure, but it is created by a synergetic impact of reputation, quality and other facts relevant to a particular business, and not just by incurring AMP expenses. They rejected the bright line test. So that was something which they said that routine and non-routine cannot be determined just by applying a bright line test, and TP adjustment on account of separate consideration, again getting something which was actually not there, is something which is not intended by law. So the facts, I think I have broadly already covered that it was in case of these taxpayers. So I will not take the facts again. I have already covered them as while explaining the concept. However, the issues before the court were that whether the additions suggested on AMP expenses is beyond the jurisdiction of the TPO, since no specific reference has been made, because the reference was all sale purchase type of transaction. So there was per se no transaction of AMP expenses. So if such kind of transaction has not been referred, whether the TPO can create a new transaction. So that was one. Second was that whether AMP expenses incurred by the taxpayer can be considered an international transaction. The third was the TP adjustment, if any, made by the AMP expenditure by applying bright line test, that whether that test is correct or not. And the fourth was that whether ITAT was right in distinguishing and directing that selling expenses which are in the nature of trade or volume discounts, etc., whether they are not to be categorized as AMP expenses. So in case of LG tribunal judgment, there was a brief relief which was given that when you are computing AMP upon expenses, you need not include the trade discounts and volume discounts, etc., as part of AMP expenditure. So there basically it was an appeal by the revenue. So I am just taking it point wise what all was held. There are some 4-5 slides like this. So the first was the jurisdiction of the TPO, that when transfer pricing officer has not been specifically referred this transaction, can he make a new transaction out of this? So High Court said that after retrospective amendment in section 92 CA 2B, the TPO has the power to determine the arm's length nature of the transaction which he may come across during the assessment proceedings, even if they have not been specifically referred to by the TPO, by the AO to the TPO. It also held that once the taxpayer has reported its international transaction, the reference is made in a composite manner, and therefore AO is not required to really determine something which is not there in the 3CB. It can be considered as by a TPO as one of the items as a composite assessment, and TPO has the jurisdiction. So that is one. Second is that whether AMP is an international transaction. So High Court upheld the view which has been taken by special bench in case of LG, and it observed that when the taxpayers themselves had actually an argument that the declared price of international transactions included a remuneration on account of AMP expenses, now saying that AMP is not an international transaction is incorrect. And it said that, and taxpayers had also taken an argument that because AMP expenses per se are third party transactions, so therefore AMP expenses should not be considered as international transaction. So there also the High Court gave its ruling in favor of revenue and said that the AMP pertains to the arm's length or adequacy of compensation to the Indian taxpayer, and if this is the element which needs to be considered, then AMP also has to be considered an international transaction. There was another issue on that when a person is actually because this generally happens in case of distributors, because like this case was actually this judgment was in case of all the distributors. So the primary business or the primary transaction is actually purchase of goods by the Indian entity from overseas entity, and then the Indian distributor sells the goods in the Indian market, and while selling the goods it actually incurs the AMP expenses. So whether we can club the transaction of this AMP, if it is being considered as a transaction, whether we can club the transaction of an AMP and the purchase transaction. So High Court observed that the taxpayers could aggregate the controlled transactions if they are closely interlinked, and it also says that once the TPO has accepted TNMM, or in some cases where the assessee themselves have accepted TNMM, then it is impermissible to separately determine the arm's length price of a particular expenditure like AMP, and because it is already factored, because TNMM is obviously at net level, so something which is already covered, you cannot determine a separate price. But in this case, so they gave the blessing that if you are using TNMM, you have already, you are clubbing the two transactions, and accordingly the price of AMP and distribution has to be really determined together. The third was the bundle, the brand building. The brand building, the High Court very categorically said, and this was actually the main thing, that whether there is any brand building done by Indian entity or not. So in this case, they actually, they have given many pages actually on this, and they observed that brand building is an outcome of various factors, and it is largely associated with the reputation and quality of the product or the service. If today BMW has got a particular quality, or Maruti Suzuki has a particular quality, or their reputation is different, it is because of the product or the service which we as customers receive. It is not only an account of AMP. In progressive business, the brand value or goodwill will show progressive increase, but in falling business it may wane. And AMP expenses, if you actually see in case of FMCG business, they have to do it because each product image has got a shelf life. We will forget to use Lifebuoy if we will not see the ad for possibly 8 months or a year. We'll forget to use Dettol, but we'll only use Savlon if we are not seeing the advertisement in the television. So it has to really play with the psychology and the mindset of the customers, and therefore it is for the progressive sales also. There are situations where brands are built without incurring any substantial AMP, and vice versa. You keep on incurring expenditure, but because your product itself is unacceptable in a particular market, that only AMP expenditure is not going to increase your sale. And therefore, brand building cannot be commensurate with the quantum of AMP expenditure. Reputed brands undertake advertisement, marketing and promotional activities to increase sales volume and earn larger profits. And overseas AEs also do sometimes engage the Indian entities for carrying out marketing, distribution, selling activity, but you have to see the model of each entity. You cannot just say that every AMP expenditure is contributing to the brand building of foreign entity image in India. On bright line test, they rejected the bright line test. They said that a routine and non-routine expenditure cannot be determined only on account of by applying bright line test. Such approach is not permissible, and per se there is no statutory recognition to this methodology in Indian regulations as well as in any international parlance. It has just come out of practice. So therefore, that out of practice, if something has been resulted, the statutory recognition cannot be given to that. Then High Court actually talked about that how do we determine then the arm's length price. So there they actually said that you have to see that whether it is, what all activities are being carried out by the Indian entity. If it is carrying out an distribution activity, or it is carrying out a marketing activity, only marketing activity, or it is carrying out both. So you have to actually see the intensity of the functions and then try to compare their margin with the with the correct comparables. So that is, this is something where we all actually make mistakes, that without seeing that whether the Indian entity is a limited risk distributor or Indian entity is a normal risk distributor or Indian entity is actually only a marketing support service provider. In all the cases, we either use RPM or we use PNMM, and then we don't really see that, and we just try to compare them with the comparables engaged in the same business. We don't see that whether characterization wise also those comparables are similar. So whether similar advertisement expenditure or similar strategic functions have been done by the comparables or not, that can generally be measured by computing AMP upon turnover expenses, which actually provides intensity of functions. So something like whether the strategic activities are also being carried out by Indian entity or not, or is it possible that overseas is actually giving everything and Indian entity is only executing. So in those cases, then generally you'll see the comparables will be very different. They may be more in the form of marketing support. So High Court gave lot of rule principles around determination of arm's length price and choosing the comparables. And lastly, they talked about economic ownership. In case of LG has said that there is no concept of economic ownership. It is only legal ownership which has to be seen. And however, in case of High Court, Delhi High Court, it said that economic ownership arises in case of long-term contracts. What is economic owner, legal owner? Legal owner is basically in whose name the brand is registered, and economic owner is which actually develops the brand in a particular market. So develops the brand in a particular market by selling the products more in that market, by doing more AMP expenses. But generally if you see, those activities are carried out not for a period of 6 months or a year, but they are carried out over a period of say 20 years, 50 years. And after 20 years, 50 years is something when a brand is actually established in the market. And therefore, the benefit arising out of that also stay with that Indian entity, and the profit arising out of that is also taxable in India. So generally, that person may be called an economic owner. If in a scenario that particular brand is globally sold by foreign entity to some unrelated party, so in that particular scenario, it is possible that when the brand will be valued, they will also see that what is the brand is carrying the value in Indian market. That is the time when you will possibly want to compensate that economic owner. So they clearly said that the valuation of such economic ownership is not done regularly, but is done when it is transferred to a third party or the rights are terminated. TP valuation would be mandated only at that time. They talked about resale price method, which I have actually just taken in case of determination of arm's length price, and direct marketing and selling expenses. They also said that volume discounts, trade discounts, etc. are not required to be considered. So this was around AMP expenses. It's a landmark judgment. The principles have obviously been laid down very categorically. Implementation, in my personal opinion, is a bit difficult. But I think it will be easier if we try to compute the ratios and try to determine the correct comparables. So, but at least from bright line test perspective, from at least something which was not there in statute, they have categorically nullified it. So we expect transfer pricing officers and DRP not to make those adjustments in those cases, at least not to apply that methodology in those cases. But I think that the moral of the story is that we need to really make good comparability study, and we need to have the specific relevant clauses and the understanding of the parties well embedded in the agreements also.
Ma'am, just one question. In this case of AMP, the very starting point that whether my entity needs to be checked for an AMP expenses, that is not clear as such. Like, or is it presupposing that each and every distributor has to have an AMP expenditure which has to be reimbursed by the AMP? Because for starting an analysis that whether I need to check my AMP expenses, how do I start with it? My entity incurring even a 1 rupee of AMP expense has to be checked for it.
So, see, the way it has to be actually, practically the way it has to be done is, the transfer pricing officer, without looking at, okay, whether you are a marketing support service provider or you are a normal risk distributor or limited risk distributor, they generally try to examine it in every case. But I think as a practitioner, the way we should see is that we should see first of all whether the Indian entity, even if it is selling, even if it is buying and selling the products, what are the functions that Indian entity is doing? Is it only executing the strategies which have been provided by the overseas entity, or it is creating its own distribution channels? So even if it might be creating its own distribution channel, but how to do that is also coming from overseas. So one is that you have to see that what is the risk Indian entity is undertaking and what are the functions that Indian entity is undertaking. If you feel that it can actually be characterized as limited risk distributor, means that strategically everything is being done by overseas, it's only Indian entity is only executing. In that case, the AMP expenses, because limited risk distributor is more like a service. Distribution per se, if you see, in only in one case actually the distributor is, it acts actually like an entrepreneur, where the manufacturer actually sells very routine goods, and it is only on account of the selling strategies that the product can actually be considered or will be sold in the market. Only in those cases the distributor can actually be called an entrepreneur. Otherwise, in most of the cases, distributor, the products are sold because of their brand and their liking by the customer. So therefore, generally the manufacturer is an entrepreneur and distributor is more like a service provider, right? So in case of limited risk distributor, in any case they are always given an assured margin, and in that case the AMP should be reimbursed by the foreign entity. Either see, there are 2-3 ways of compensating for such expenses. One is by just pricing of goods. I'll just give you an example. Say you have a gross margin upon turnover of your tested party is say at around 32% or say 35%, and your net or your AMP upon expenses is 10%, right? So 32%, 10%, but your comparables have got gross margin upon turnover is say around 25%, so which is actually less. So that means they would have purchased the goods at a higher price, leading to a less gross margin. But their AMP expenses are actually 5%, right? So what will happen is that at net level, they will actually, so that entity has got 32 and AMP expenses at 10, so it will actually have 22. And this entity, the other comparables, will have 25 minus 10, which will actually be 15. So although your tested party has actually net level 22% and your comparables have got actually 15% in our example, but what TPOs were doing that because your AMP expenditure are 5% more than, so just make an adjustment. So now what happened in this case, with the example which I am giving to you, is that AMP expenses have also been taken care by giving a better pricing of the goods. So the goods have been purchased at a lower price by the tested party, so as to get an RPM of 32, which will have, so that the Indian entity has an appetite to undertake more or to absorb more AMP expenses and still earn better profitability.
So can we just conclude that though the guideline test has been denied for determining the ALP of the AMP expenses, can it still be used as a tool for determining whether I have to check my AMP expenses against my comparables or not?
I think you have
the starting point.
Yes,
Then
you
we
have
can
to.
use bright, like
Yes.
you likely said that you have already used the guideline easily by comparing the AMP
Yes,
of
yes.
the tested party
So
with the
we
comparables.
should try to see the holistic picture.
And when our AMP is already less than the comparable margin, so we need not test for the.
I will say that you test everything at net level also. So now the question is whether you should test the things at gross margin level or you should test the things at net level. So at least the High Court has said that the pricing of the goods or the AMP, both the things need to be considered together while determining the pricing of the goods or the international transaction. So both the things have to be considered. So I feel that in your case also, or the cases which we do, we should try to see the things at net level, or we'll have to see it holistically.
So I think the starting step always is the characterization. So whether it is a distributor, is it a licensed manufacturer, within a distributor, is it a limited risk distributor? Once you characterize the entity, you also know whether in the pricing itself, is the foreign entity embedding certain advertisement and marketing expenses. So first understand your taxpayers' profiling, the price setting mechanism. And then when you do your comparability, you try and find like comparables. But as Suchi gave that example, the High Court actually gave a very, very simple example of taking, in a case 1,000 rupees as sales, in option 2 also 1,000. The import price in case 1 being 600, in case 2 being 500. So what was your gross profit margin? In one case was, the first case was 400, case 2 was 500. You then had overheads 300, both sides. Then you had AMP. Case 1, 50. So your net margins was 50. In case 2, your AMP was 150. Your net margin is 50. So, is it right to therefore penalize case 2 taxpayer to say that you have spent 100? And what would the tax authorities do? Okay, you spent 100 more, I'm going to disallow this 100 and charge a markup.
They are accepting the DNM and therefore
Absolutely. So broadly, very simply put, this cannot be. So this was really resulting in a big, adjustment for the taxpayers. And I think a lot of times what was happening was taxpayers weren't doing justice to themselves by explaining this problem. Which is coming back to a very good question which you raised as to what is my basis of starting?
exactly, like it assumed that each and every distributor has to have an app.
Yeah.
Because it was not discussed there.
Another issue will come while applying the bright line test to comparatively. Now more and more consumer goods, white goods, the photocopy machine, there are so many other equipment where foreigners are there. The only Indian owned companies are very few. And they are not so aggressive in marketing. So while applying the bright line test, I'm going to exclude all the controlled transactions. And suppose BMW's AMP expense is to be compared with Ashok Leyland or Tata Motors, where the focus is more on the heavy vehicles or commercial vehicles and not on motor cars. If I have the option, I will purchase BMW, I am going to purchase Tata. So how can the AMP of Tata can be compared with BMW or Mercedes?
Absolutely.
So there is a whole fallacy there in applying bright line.
Which was upheld in the case of Maruti Suzuki. Wherein they compared, they said, how can you compare Maruti Suzuki to, say a Tata Motors and all of it? Also, as you rightly put, within the car manufacturers, you will see a car manufacturer when he has a new model which is in a particular year, his advertisement and marketing spend will be much higher vis-a-vis a car manufacturer who doesn't have a new model launched that year. So in the LG decision which Suchi spoke about, there were a set of 14 conditions which were laid out. One of the conditions, in fact, over there mentioned about that you cannot even compare in this case of an AMP spend with other Indian companies which had a domestic brand. So that is why when they have remanded it back to the transfer pricing officer to look at comparability. But on that itself, it's going to be a huge challenge. Because how does one really find comparables which are in the public domain which are really like to like? That's what you were saying, we were discussing this before the session with a few of you. That there lies the challenge. Sorry, I'm conscious of time. It is 11:35. We wanted to cover 2 more issues, guarantees, but yeah, so guarantees, I think you have another session on financial transactions.
Management charge.
We just need management. Sure.
But devote 10 minutes.
Just 5-10 minutes.
So, management charge on a very broad basis, the understanding is that it's an intra-group services. So, what kind of intra-group services which are actually provided by generally the head office of any company? It may be Indian outbound also, it may be the foreign MNCs having companies in India. So, you'll have internal audit, risk management services, legal, HR, technical services, information IT platform, etc., etc. So generally what happens is that because of uniformity, because of consistency, and because of they want to have approximately everything at the same platform, they generally have hub kind of model where they provide the services, where the intra-group services are provided by one hub to all the entities globally. Now in that case, what the the issue has generally been that whether this will be, this can actually be, whether this can actually be considered as a service, at what rate the cost should actually be allocated, and what can be the markup, or what can be actually the pricing for such kind of service. Now, so this has actually been the dispute, that whether the cost can actually be allocated because the Indian entity is getting the benefit out of it. Second is whether the cost needs to be with markup or without markup, and how do we determine the arm's length price for that. And there are certain services which actually are done in the, as more like a shareholder. That if the Indian entity, if the overseas entity is actually looking at some strategic investments in India or overseas, so or it is actually looking at consolidation activities, or it is doing something which is purely required more as a shareholder. So say consolidation work. Now the consolidation work per se will never impact Indian entities operations. It is not required for India. But because it is required for global, so they will do the consolidation work, so there will be a lot of people, but whether those kind of costs need to be allocated or not. So those